Hello everyone, my name is Anna. I am the VP of Sustainability Director of our Green Campus Action Plan. I'm so excited to have you guys watching our podcast. This is our special edition episode with my faculty mentor, Dr. Sasser. And just introducing Dr. Sasser. She's known for her work in not only researching climate action, climate change, but also the impact that it has on women's bodies, reproductive justice, and reproductive rights, and what that means. And she also researches mental health impacts of climate change as well, which is a very niche topic, but she has contributed greatly to through her multiple books. She's working on her third book right now, which I'm very excited to buy, yay. We're going to talk about our specific book and also podcast on climate anxiety and the kid question today. So we're going to go ahead and ask you a little bit about it. But how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I am excited to talk to you. I didn't even know GCAP had a podcast, so when I found out, I was like, get me on this.
Yes, amazing. Before we get into your book and your work with your podcast as well, and specifically your research too, I wanted to understand a little bit more about your background, your personal experiences. So just like wondering how did you come about to like sustainability and like environmentalism? Like what made you passionate about it? Was it a cultural tradition? Was it a family tradition? A memory, something that like was passed on to you? Like how did you become interested in this?
It was not cultural, it was not family, it was not long-term at all. It was school, actually. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles. For me, being outdoors meant going to the beach. That is something that my family and I did together every weekend. But I didn't think about it, and my parents didn't talk about it through a sustainability lens. One of the things they did sort of plant the early seed around was how people pollute the environment too much, and how having, trash and waste and unwanted, maybe even dangerous things, out in the places that we want to enjoy outside, that is something that is harmful to all of us. And so I guess you could say that was an early seed that was planted from childhood because, growing up in LA, we went to Santa Monica Beach, we went to Venice Beach, and those beaches, the sand is extremely polluted. So we would see all kinds of things that didn't belong in the sand as young children, and we would participate in beach cleanup days. But in my mind, that wasn't connected to what we today call sustainability. And that language for me came when I was in college, and it really came when I was in grad school. So initially I was studying anthropology. I was studying medical anthropology. I was most interested in reproductive health and rights, which I still am, but through a medical anthropology lens. And so in grad school, and even actually before grad school, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Madagascar, and I learned about how in countries around the world that have histories of population control, the emphasis in reproductive health and rights is really on protecting the environment from people. And what that means is helping people reduce the number of children that they have in order to protect natural spaces and wilderness and animal species often without regard to the actual health and social needs of those people. So having done that, then coming back to school, I thought, okay, so reproductive rights issues are deeply connected to environmental and sustainability based issues, and at least in international development, it's through this lens of population control. So I wanted to study that connection, and that's what got me eventually interested in sustainability, but I'm taking the long route to tell that story because I want people to understand there's no one path to an interest in sustainability or environmentalism, and for some it could come very roundabout through an interest in reproductive rights and how sustainability and environment have been misused to control people's bodies and reproduction.
So would you say that you got your cultural anthropology master's from UC Berkeley, and then you also transitioned to getting your PhD in environmental science, policy, and management, I believe? I guess, was it your experience in Madagascar? was it your research interest in population control that led you to want to get your PhD in environmental science, or what like led to that shift?
So I was doing my PhD in medical anthropology, but I was still thinking about my experience with Peace Corps. And the experience with Peace Corps was this. I saw very, very clearly that in Madagascar, and I knew this to be true of other countries too, the overemphasis on population and managing the number of children people have meant that other reproductive health issues and rights concerns were underemphasized. So for example, young girls and young women couldn't have access to sex education or other forms of birth control other than those that had been sanctioned by leaders in their community. So I went into this rural community in Madagascar determined to be a health worker and actually a sex ed teacher. That was my first teaching job, high school sex education. And I was really limited in what I could do because government officials were telling me what I couldn't do. And so I was like, oh, this is very political. And the political piece was both about reproductive health and rights, but also about environmental issues too. How environmental issues and sustainability could be talked about or not. The emphasis on parks and protected wilderness areas versus the spaces where people live, work, and play all day, every single day. I mean, that's the environment too, right? If we think about it through a justice lens. So I got that deep, deep education in the field, in Madagascar, in a place where I did not go there to do that.
Yes.
And I think for me, the unexpectedness of that journey is what made it all better for me. And I have found in other ways through life, it's the unexpected that has been more meaningful than the things that I expected to do or the paths that I expected to pursue. So anyway, I was coming back to school after that and saying, okay, what would be more meaningful to pursue through a research perspective and getting a PhD? And I really started to delve into those questions. I talked them through with my professors, my committee. I went back to Madagascar and stayed for a longer period of time to do dissertation research, and then ended up leaving and having to do my research here because the country went into a civil war. But yeah, staying open to the unexpected, seeing what I learned abroad, that was really what put me on the path that led me to where we are right now.
Great things. Yes, because I love that quote, like unexpected things like really lead you to greatness, because for me, like I'm a sociology major and I went into sustainability through student government. I completely wasn't expecting myself to do this. I was just like, oh, I was just gonna be advocating for like students in my major and just like stick to my field, and then like, but deep down, like I really cared about like the environment. So I'm glad that like we relate on that. I also wanted to ask, since we're talking about population control, I know that in like previous interviews you've done that you talked about like how there's a difference between two groups of environmentalists. There's like the group of environmentalists who specifically talk about saving the earth in a lens that does emphasize population control and specifically does like kind of paint women of color specifically as the perpetrators of harm like towards our planet. And then also contrasting them with environmentalists who do really care about the earth and understand that population control isn't the issue. It's like the polluters, the corporations, the companies that are driving all of this like chemical and toxic change in our environment. So what would you say to the environmentalists who are on the ethical side and who are on the right side and who get shot down when they start talking about these polluters and like want to hold them accountable?
Well, first and foremost, I would say anyone who is interested in environmentalism and sustainability and conservation generally is on the ethical side, even if their kind of priority set of issues is less progressive. And what I mean by that is population has always been part of the environmental movement. The mainstream American environmental movement really took off in the middle of the 20th century with people like Rachel Carson with her book Silent Spring, She was followed by Paul Ehrlich, who recently passed away actually a couple months ago, but he was a well-known conservation biologist at Stanford who really got population on the national kind of agenda as an environmental issue. He was not a big, bad villain. And what I mean by that is, he actually believed that he was doing the right thing by trying to get the average American person to rethink the connection between their personal and private behavior in the bedroom or in terms of how many children they wanted, and to connect that to what was happening in our country and on our planet in terms of resource consumption, resource conservation, etc. He got it wrong. That is well known. It is a well-known fact. Paul Ehrlich was wrong. But I just want to say that people like Ehrlich who had focused on the wrong thing weren't necessarily villains. The challenge is it's really easy to go with these simplistic common sense framings that say things like too many people consume too many resources and are therefore bad for the planet. That's like a really easy common thing to say.
Yeah.
And it's seductive because you don't actually have to engage in any kind of critical thinking.
Yes.
But the thing about that kind of framework is it's a fallacy. And how do we know it's a fallacy? We know it's a fallacy because population growth rates and fertility rates have been coming down for 80 years now. They were already coming down when Paul Ehrlich was spreading the alarm, ringing the alarm, I should say, on population growth. The other thing is that as those fertility numbers and birth rates have come down consistently for 80 years, our consumption of resources has gone up. Our greenhouse gas emissions have gone up. Our energy consumption, our water consumption have gone up. Right now, we are at the lowest rates in terms of our birth rates in this country of any time in recorded history, and yet we are consuming more energy and more water through data centers than any point in recent history. So make it make sense. If you're a person who says that the issue is population, make it make sense with how these data centers are consuming these resources and polluting local communities.
Exactly.
And will continue to do so at rapidly increased rates in the future.
Yes, exactly, because we actually did, for GCAP, we did Isotope Rice, and we did an event for our Earth Month. We did a Let's Talk Data Centers event with Sierra Club, and one of their senior campaign managers actually came, Julia Dowell, I think, she came and she spoke to us about not only are data centers responsible for a lot of water consumption, but what's not often talked about in media too is their energy consumption. And there's like some bills, actually, it's like California Senate Bill 886, 887, if folks want to look into that. They're trying to hold these data centers who are like looking at California for like sites like accountable for how much energy they use, and them being able to charge local taxpayers for the energy they're using, even though like there's not a direct correlation with the local customers in the data centers. Trying to hold the data centers accountable just for like their energy usage and asking them not to use gasoline and like stuff like that.
Absolutely. I mean, so they are definitely making local residents pay, offsetting the costs of the operation of these centers. I also want to say that it's not just energy consumption and water consumption, but there's also a significant amount of air pollution that comes along with the life cycle of these data centers, and the communities that are surrounding them are disproportionately exposed. And a lot of these communities surrounding data centers tend to be lower income and comprised of marginalized communities. I read a study today that hypothesized that somewhere in the arena of that marginalized communities experience somewhere around 200 times the amount of air pollution around data centers compared with non-marginalized communities that are further away. From an environmental justice perspective, that doesn't shock me, but it's horrible.
That's disgusting. But it does remind me of a question I wanted to ask you, actually. So, I mean, talking about like marginalized communities too, I know you talked about how, like in your preface specifically for your book, in Climate Anxiety and the Kid Question, you discuss how a lot of like newspapers, media sources, they never discuss how race was a factor for why folks don't want to have children when it comes to like worries about their climate change. So, like, how did you feel when you learned about this and when you saw it, when you were reviewing sources? Like, did you feel discouraged, or did it actually like motivate you to want to do your like book project even more?
I'm never discouraged. I'm always motivated, and the reason why is, I'm used to people saying that people of color don't care about the environment, or that people of color are not environmentally active. That's an old set of assumptions and stereotypes. I know it to be false, but I also know that that has been pervasive in the dominant mainstream narrative for a really long time. And so I'm always about proving that kind of idea wrong.
Yes.
So to back up for a moment, in 2020, I was fully planning to do a completely different project, climate emotions, climate anxiety. That was nowhere on my radar. Early 2020, February, in fact, I was making plans to go to Madagascar for some months to study energy use at the household level, household cooking, and how that impacts environmental and health related issues. And then we started getting word of a virus that was going around that was infecting a lot of people, and I believe it was people in Seattle needed to stay home. And I thought, well, that's too bad for them. I make my plans and go to Madagascar. And sure enough, within a month, I was like, oh my God, I might have to stay home for 2 weeks.
We
all know what happened from there. But so it was during that time when I was literally grounded. I had to cancel my flight, and I had plans to be abroad for 6 months. So I was like, what do I do now? I have no other plans. I have this block of time to do research. I had gotten all of these permissions. I had this full proposal. I was ready to go, and I couldn't do it. And I was at home because of this really big, scary virus that was killing people. And the thing is, at the time I lived in Pasadena, a couple blocks away from my home, there was a place where elderly people were living together, a rehab facility. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that was the neighborhood hotspot for COVID, and it was 2 blocks away. And nowadays that doesn't sound like anything, but at the time we didn't know anything about this virus other than that it killed people. So knowing that that was 2 blocks away, knowing that I couldn't leave home, knowing that I was afraid to go to the grocery store, knowing that I was afraid for all of my own elderly relatives, that produced a certain amount of anxiety.
Yes.
And that was the time when I started to read about climate anxiety.
Yes.
And the reason why was because I knew that for a future project, I wanted to study why some young environmental activists weren't having children. Mm-hmm. So I started reading about that, but all of the articles went back to anxiety, climate anxiety, climate emotions, climate depression, and I was like, what is this? Why are they all talking about mental health? Which obviously sounds ridiculous, but at the time, I had not made that connection in my own life, and it wasn't quite so common to hear other people making the connection. Nowadays, eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, everyone's talking about it. It's very common. But believe it or not, 6 years ago, it really was not so common. So when I kept seeing this coming up in the articles that I was reading, I was confused, but then intrigued. I wanted to learn more. And I noticed that everyone talking about it was not of color. And I was like, what is going on? Mm-hmm. And then I started reading these quotes where people were saying that people of color don't care. Whenever I hear that kind of phrase or statement being made, I immediately get suspicious and start looking for evidence. Is this true or is it not? So I immediately looked at the evidence, and A, it wasn't true, but B, no one was asking. Yes. And then that, I think, is the most irresponsible thing that happens. When people say, well, this group of people just isn't impacted or they just don't care, I have found that often it really means that group of people has been overlooked in the research. They haven't been asked, they haven't been considered, and those assumptions are often based on racist beliefs about, people of color. And so when I saw that silence around race and vulnerability and saw that the focus was that young, predominantly white, predominantly middle class or upper middle class young people were the ones who were most concerned about climate change and had the most emotional responses to it, I said, I feel deeply that that's not true, but I need the evidence to back me up, so I'm going to do the research that no one else had been doing.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a book about it. And so to answer your earlier question, I'm never discouraged. In a moment like that, I'm like, this is where they need me, and they need my research skills, so this is what I'm going to do.
Exactly. Yes. Oh my gosh, amazing. Thank you for that. And I guess when it comes to now that you were motivated and you were like, okay, I have to find the evidence, and you did, and you did a national survey, you did interviews, and what it was 2,500 folks.
2,500 people across the country were surveyed, then a few dozen interviews.
Yes. So, research data is everywhere, and I guess when you were writing about your results and your discussions, what was the most surprising thing that you found, and then what was the most interesting? Or I guess both could apply to you.
I think both are surprising and interesting. I think the most surprising thing that I found was that for some young people, and when I say young people, I'm talking about Gen Z. For some Gen Zers, the thought of having kids is a bad thing. I heard in interviews that some people were like, when I sit around with my friends and we talk about the future and I'd say that I want to have kids, my friends are like, ew, why would you want to do that? To me, that was shocking. I had never heard that before. And then I heard it again and again and again. Now, is that true across the board? No, of course not, no. But it is more true among more groups of Gen Zers than it has ever been true of any other generational group in this country. The other thing that I found interesting and surprising is that this conversation around reproductive anxiety, so being anxious about whether, when, and how to have children ever in the future, is now shaping how young people are approaching dating. That was really surprising to me. So I interviewed a number of people who talked about their Tinder dates, starting off with a discussion of whether they want kids or not. And I was like, what? I was quite surprised.
No, hello, how are you? Just, do you want to have kids?
I'm sure they were saying hello, how are you? But it never in a million years would have crossed my mind that would be a conversation for a first date.
Yes.
And I heard from multiple people that it was, and I was like, whoa, this is even more stark than anything I anticipated as a researcher. I thought, oh, this is just going to be among people who are super into activism, or they're going to talk about it with their environmentalist friends, and no, they were having these conversations with their families, with their parents, with their partners, and with their first dates, saying, hey, if you want that, good for you, but I'm not the person for you. And so if that's a desire that you need to be met in the future, you're not going to meet it with me, and we should end this now. And I was like, whoa, this is a big shift. It's not always about environmental issues, though. So to be clear, the interviews that I did for the book were really revealing, and the concerns among young people are financial. Will I ever have a career?
Yes.
I'm graduating from college and all I'm finding are these fellowships and internships that really don't pay very well at all, and the full-time jobs I'm looking for require graduate degrees. When will I ever get a real salary? Will I ever afford to buy a house? These are the concerns that I heard people voicing.
Yes.
And then a lot of young people who I interviewed, they were worried in general about their own mental and emotional stability and whether they were in a position to have children, they didn't want to traumatize children. They wanted to be in a more stable place, even separate from how they felt about the climate or environment. When you're not feeling hopeful about the world that you would bring them into, it leads to rethinking whether to bring them into that world or not.
Exactly. Thank you for that. And I mean, speaking of like the generational differences, I think when reading about this research and also reading your book, I think a common, and also when watching Katrina Babies for our research, I think a common misconception for me was that I was the only one feeling this way, and that like the generational difference, if I knew that the elder like family members in my family didn't care about climate change, like it didn't bother them as much as it did me, that I also felt that it got passed along in generations. I didn't realize that other Gen Zers were also feeling the same way I was in terms of climate anxiety and like a lot of fear and angst when it came to this. And I didn't realize that until we were doing our research, and I was reading your book, I was reading Hickman's articles, other podcasts and videos. And I guess what's a common misconception that you've experienced when like presenting your research to other folks, and what's something that they come into your presentation wanting to hear, and then you tell them something else that maybe they weren't expecting, and that was like a misconception for them, like, whoa, like...
Common misconception. Well, before I get into that, I do want to put in a plug for the documentary that you've mentioned a couple times. It's a film called Katrina Babies. It is available, I believe, on HBO Max, but it's actually the only documentary about climate anxiety that is full feature length and is about race and poverty and social marginalization. So it looks at a group of kids who experienced Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans as children, and then it interviews them 20 years later to see what the impacts of the storm were, particularly mentally and emotionally. It is a gripping film. It's very powerful. If you have any suspicion or skepticism as to whether climate anxiety exists or not, you won't anymore after watching that film. But it's also very compelling. But to the rest of your question, so misconceptions. I think, so there's a lot that is said about generational divides. This notion that young people, Gen Z in particular, are deeply, deeply committed to environmental issues, deeply care about what's happening to the planet, and that older people don't as much, or kind of have left the planet in a terrible state and are like, hey y'all, we're out, deuces, but please take care of what we have left for you. That's like a really crude way of putting it. That is a conversation, but the reality is that, and I say this as someone who was born like in this tiny little sandwich generation between Gen X and millennials. It's called Gen Y. We exist. But so as someone who was born during this period of time, I can tell you, we did not grow up hearing about climate change in school. We started hearing about global warming, but by that time, literally, I was already in like junior high school, and the thing is, the conversation was always, this is something that is coming in the future, okay? So I think that is the main generational divide. Older people, let's say Gen Y and up, always believed that climate change would be something that would happen off in some distant future, really after we die. And so millennials onward have had a radically different understanding that climate change is real, that it is present, and that it is shaping your entire lives. From the day you're born until the day you will die, you'll never experience a day without climate change.
Exactly.
It's a very, completely different mindset.
Yes.
And I think that we all have to give each other a little bit of grace.
Yes.
For understanding that our basic understandings of reality when it comes to climate change are very different because we were educated differently about it. The general awareness of climate change that became pervasive in popular culture didn't really occur until late 80s into the 90s. And again, it was the language of global warming,
Yes.
not climate change. And then it took a lot longer than that, I would say, for it to become something that is connected to these extreme shifts, long-term shifts in weather that we're experiencing. So I think the misconception is that older people don't care, or that we are intentionally leaving a really messed up planet for you all to just clean up for us. I do want to say it's not that older people are lazy or checked out or just don't care, but part of it is this sense of we know that we have contributed greatly to all of these really negative, destructive environmental outcomes. We don't necessarily know the best way to go about reversing that, especially given the political structure that we are in and the people that we have contributed to putting into office. But we feel like younger people have better skills, tools, resources, passions, abilities. Let's let them lead. That for me is the biggest misconception.
Thank you for that, because that was also a misconception I had just now. In my generation, we have always felt that because of governmental inaction, that we also correlate that to, by association, older folks not caring as well. But that doesn't necessarily have to be true. So thank you for correcting that. And then I think for our final question, I wanted to ask you, after reading about A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah J. Ray, I learned about self-regulation when it comes to eco-anxiety and doing research in this topic and in this field of climate anxiety, eco-anxiety. And this is very emotionally taxing work, and I can only imagine that you started this project in 2020 and you finished your book in 2024. For 4 years you were dealing with all these surveys and these interviews. What were some ways that you self-regulated and you kept yourself grounded while doing this highly impactful work?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I do want to say that the biggest challenge I find to emotional self-regulation is isolation. And what I mean by that is the only way that you can feel that you're the only person going through something is if you don't know if others are going through it or not. And you don't have a community, you don't have a space to talk it through with others, you don't have resources for support. And so that isolation, I think, is the biggest enemy to self-regulating, and the biggest antidote to isolation is coming together and forming community with others. Now, that may not be the people who you're already in community with, so you might have to seek out and build a new community. Fortunately for us in 2026, there are communities that are all over the place that exist online. They exist in person, they exist in so many ways, and so you can join a community literally right now today. Climate cafes are online communities where people can go and be in community with other people who are deeply climate aware and who have a lot of feelings about it and want to talk about those feelings. There is the Climate Mental Health Network. It's an organization that I have worked with. I've been on their board for a couple of years to help people have the hard conversations. And again, the conversations sometimes are only hard because we haven't been having them, right? So you use this tool. There's a climate emotions wheel that was developed by researchers. It can be found at the Climate Mental Health Network, but it is a color wheel that breaks down the 4 most common areas of emotion that people express in response to their feelings about climate change, and then it breaks those down even further. So it's a wheel of many, many emotions. And it's used as a tool that people can have a conversation with to identify how they're feeling about any aspect of climate change. It could just be something like, how do you feel about it being 112 degrees today? Oh, I have a lot of feelings about that. I feel like this, and that can be the start of a conversation. For me as a researcher, The emotionally taxing work came early on when I was first studying population control, because population control has specifically and intentionally targeted Black women and other women of color, and it was hard to read that research, but I developed skills to manage that so that when it came time to move into this area of research, I was already resourced up.
Yes.
And one of the things that is most important, I think, for anyone in anything that you do that is emotionally taxing is limit yourself. Do not doom scroll. Do not spend 24 hours a day looking for more information on that thing. That frightens you. It is frightening, but you don't have to be in a space of fear all the time, right? So make sure that you, A, limit the amount of information that you consume. B, talk to other people, create community as needed, and stay in community. Don't retreat from it because you feel like you're doing better now. And then the other thing I would say is really, really, really sink into those things that you enjoy doing and that make you happy. You don't have to be a climate warrior 24 hours a day. One of the things that I learned when I was researching my book is that there were some young people I talked to who felt guilty about their major in college because the major had nothing to do with environmental issues or the climate struggle. That, no. All majors are needed. All perspectives, all forms of knowledge are needed. I think these folks in particular were artists, and they were like, what does that have to do with? And I was like, are you kidding? We need music to be happy. We need happiness sometimes. We need film, television, visual art, dance, whatever, in order to help us feel a sense of peace and happiness and connectedness to something bigger than ourselves that isn't, depressing and scary.
Thanks so much. We get a round of applause. Yay! Oh my gosh, thank you so much for joining our talk today. I really appreciate all of your responses, and thank you for your insight into not only like the research that you did, but also the emotional side of doing it and how taxing it can be, and also like surprising things that you heard and things that were misconceptions and fixing those. So thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.